inside everything.
All right, welcome back to another episode of The Strategy Inside Everything. Very excited today, and I know I say that every episode, but today is even more excited than usual because we have someone that I've been following for a long time on Twitter, watching talks from and reading books. This is Faris Yakob. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you. It's very nice to be here.
Faris, it feels to me like the people who listen to the show probably already know who you are from. I knew you from Twitter going back a long ways. I paid attention when it came out. Mm-hmm. But would you, for those who don't know, would you give people a quick download on who you are and what you've been up to?
Absolutely, yes. Let's start now. I'm Faris. Hello. I'm, as you pointed out, the author of a book called Paid Attention, which is about the nature of human attention and how advertising needs it, breaks it, uses it, and how the internet changes that. And with my wife, I have co-founded a consultancy, a nomadic consultancy called Genius Steals. So for the past 5 years, we have lived on the road, entirely itinerantly, moving from client to client, working with agencies and brands on a number of sort of strategic and innovation-like projects. Prior to that, we spent 5 years in New York. My career is predominantly advertising. I was the founder of a small agency in New York under the MDC banner or sort of holding company. Before that, I was chief digital officer of McCann Erickson in New York. And before that, I spent many years at Naked in London, Sydney, and in New York.
Awesome. Great background. And I have so many questions for you, but we do have a topic. So I'm going to hold myself to the topic today.
Okay.
We are going to talk about the way that universes are created and shaped in fiction and why those things keep popping up and growing all around us. Mm-hmm. And when you brought up this idea for this topic, I thought, oh yeah, this is going to be a good one. This is going to be a really interesting conversation.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Let's start at the top. Right just now, I think when we were talking about this a while back, you said you started the whole thing by saying, what about Star Wars?
I did.
And that's kind of where that's one of the biggest and most famous ones, especially right now with the newest film coming out.
Yes.
So thoughts on that universe in particular as an archetype?
Yeah, absolutely. So I feel I should apologize slightly for my lack of preparation in the sense of I haven't yet seen the most recent movie. I mean, it's only been 4 days.
Yeah, neither have I, okay, so don't worry about it.
No spoilers, you guys. No spoilers. Feel free to listen. But so I think, so we can talk about that as a sort of paradigmatic idea, right? So when you first see the first Star Wars movie and it opens as episode 4, and it references things that happened before and after and outside the film, you can already see that Lucas had an extraordinarily expansive ambition.
Right.
He had already begun to build this idea that this narrative would exist within a much larger universe. And I think at the time it was pretty compelling. But we could probably start a little bit earlier because it'll converge with Marvel at a certain point about 8 years ago when they bought it, right?
Right.
So I have a thesis as to why universes are so prevalent now, but I guess my interest in them predates all of that because I'm a geek, of a certain flavor.
Are you a comic book guy?
Yes, I'm a huge comic book guy. I used to be a very big comic book guy. In fact, my parents are selling their house in London finally, and the biggest issue, all I have left really there, apart from memorabilia, is X number of thousand of comic books in Mylar sleeves that need a good home. So if anybody listening wants to buy a lot of comics, by the way, you feel free to reach out because I can't really store them any longer. But yes, comic book universes were a big thing. So the Marvel universe was my kind of particular thing. I was very interested in that and how that kind of, I guess, to begin with, simply because it's such a satisfying idea to my brain that these things interconnect, right? And if you read anything I've written about creativity or ideas, I'm all about connections and combinations and finding patterns in different places. And so I always really liked this idea that universe existed outside of the single story, the single characters, and that, you get this kind of hit of recognition along with a sort of blast of the new when a character appears in a different, comic book or whatever, right? That sort of intertextuality, to use a much more more pretentious way of saying it, but essentially it's intertextuality, right? Taking my English degree and applying it backwards to my childhood, I was already interested in intertextuality. And so I was thinking about that, and then Star Trek and Star Wars are similar kinds of ideas. There's something very satisfying to the geeky mind that you can sort of read encyclopedias of these fictional universes that sort of hold together in some ongoing way, Mm-hmm. In fact, I had a friend, Ivan, who was at MIT on their future of the Media Masters, that put together the Futures of Entertainment, the FOE conference, and he at one point was going to be that guy at Lucasfilm who sort of looked after the canon, the one person who keeps track of all the different planets and characters and storylines and species and
that's
whatever.
Huge.
Yeah.
Now Reddit does that for you.
Right, exactly. But it's sort of one of those ultimate geek positions, to own the universe in your head. So
and what do you think? Let's talk about that exact part of the universe where George Lucas sells his company to Disney.
Yeah.
And day one, Disney says, okay, everything after this point is no longer canon. And they get rid of all the novelizations and all of I think the whole comic book universe extension was scrapped as well.
Yep.
And the fan uproar of, holy crap, all these things that we have been reading about and obsessing over are canceled. What does that mean? So
I think that is a huge thing. And I think Marvel had a very similar problem that at a certain point after 50 years of ancillary storytelling and character development and many, many hands touching the body of the universe, it began to struggle under its own weight. So the Marvel universe, the X-Men universe, the Star Wars universe got so big that no one could really do anything new without contradicting pre-existing storylines that had happened in the future or the past. And so they sort of backed themselves into a corner a little bit because no one was capable of writing for the universe anymore because no one could know enough about the universe apart from that one guy who owns the canon to actually do that, without making mistakes. So it became too weighty, too much difficulty. But yes, there's a huge kickback from fandom. And, I'm sure we'll probably get into kind of the nature of fandom. And Henry Jenkins obviously is kind of one of the great scholars about fandom and the transmedia kind of concept, which is partially about universe development, I think. But fandom is very possessive often. And if you spent a great deal of effort memorizing every lineage and storyline in the same way that a sports person would memorize baseball stats from the early parts of the baseball universe, that kind of makes sense, actually. Yeah, why not? Yeah, and you get attached. You get attached to that knowledge. I can remember, I haven't read comic books steadily for a long time. I pick up trade paperbacks or series here and there, but when I used to read them, especially Marvel, or DC has the same thing, I can remember being confounded when I would get to a page in an X-Men or an Avengers where it's like, see issue 429 of the original Hulk, and thinking, oh, I have to go track that thing down to understand what that means? Yes. So it's, the crossing the chasm model, that kind of early strategy model, Geoffrey Moore talking about how in technology adoption curves, it isn't simply just early adopters through to laggards. There is this chasm where there are two distinct typologies, right? That geeks like things that are hard because they want to test things, break things. They want to know how they're being involved. They want to, have encyclopedic knowledge of certain categories and demonstrate that knowledge, right? So geeks in every category, be it technology or universes, have a different set of needs than the broader audience. And the challenge of the weight of the universe, especially the Marvel universe, which got very complex before the sort of filmic reboot essentially that happened, which rewrote the comics backwards, basically. Nick Fury became a black guy backwards in history, in sort of history, time, whatever, universes. So there wasn't enough ways in. They just had closed themselves off to the mass audience, and I think that's part of the challenge of telling stories in a way that's in a similar way to Pixar telling stories that both adults and children can get at different levels. The great challenge of universe storytelling is to not make it just an homage, just a parody, or just a set of geeky references to trigger fanboy screams, but also to make it a story that exists in its own right, that appeals beyond just reference and intertextuality.
Yeah, and if we can think about the other side of it, a big part of making films now is to try to come up with something that's a tentpole, that's going to be able to be a property, that's a series that has a universe.
Yes.
And I wonder, I actually told my kids, hey, we're going to sit down and we're going to read Harry Potter together.
Nice.
And my daughter was like, I don't know, Dad, that's just a lot to dig into.
Mm-hmm.
And she knew that there was 6-7 books, and she knew that then we would probably watch the movies. And she was just thinking like, I don't know if I can handle all that stuff. And which, she didn't use the word canon, but I was kind of thinking like, I think she's got canon burnout. I think she's got too many things in her brain. And she was like, no more. I'm closing the shop here.
I think that's a very interesting observation, that at a certain point it becomes difficult to enter a fandom or a universe because there's so much history you feel you have to work through. It's like trying to watch The Wire. It's like trying to go back and watch The Wire now. You're like, it's quite a lot of it, isn't there? That's quite a big commitment.
And the pressure to like it is so high.
Yes, also. I mean, my wife just read Harry Potter series in the last 2 weeks. She reads very fast. But even she's like, the beginning is much more fun at the very beginning, where you're it's light and it's short. And even you can see it in the distribution of pages in the Harry Potter books, right? By the end, the books are like 4 or 5 times the length. They're massively complex storylines that are weaving together different elements and such,
Yeah, the first one's pretty breezy.
It is very short and very, breezy. But that feeling of, do I want to commit to something this serious? I think it plays to a lot of people, and it's kind of part of the previous barriers to, Star Wars or Star Trek, I suppose.
And do you think the recent, so they rebooted Star Wars, or they didn't reboot Star Wars, but they extended Star Wars.
Yes.
They rebooted Star Trek, and then they told us, no, it's not a reboot. It connects to the Star Trek universe.
Yeah.
Now.
Yes, exactly. And I think that confusion is interesting. No, go on.
Do you think that those relaunches are ways in for people, or are they more daunting obviously for Star Wars, I can see through ticket sales that it's not daunting at all, but for new customers to go back in time and watch the original Star Trek series, for example, or download the Next Generation to try to understand.
The TNG, here's my hot take. TNG is the best Star Trek by far. It's just brilliant.
That is the hottest take.
Picard is by far the greatest captain. Anyway,
he's hard to not like.
He's amazing. And Data is the best version of that character, which appears in all the seasons, which is the emotionless, whatever. But yes and no, right? So I think they are designed to be ways in and that it can be taken too far, right? If you keep rebooting something, then people start to lose some relationship to the universe, I feel like. So Transformers movies have been rebooted so many times now, they're not really even films anymore. They're sort of, I don't know exactly what they are. Quite fun visual spectacles, but I don't know if they're, universe building in the same way.
No, I don't know what they're doing.
No, I'm not sure either. But they do, they hang together. The voice of Optimus Prime is the same guy who did the voice of the cartoon Optimus Prime. So there's this sort of, they have this continuity, but it's a bit broken. I do think they're designed to be ways in. I think one of the challenges that Marvel has faced in recent years, because if you look at the Marvel comic sales are down quite precipitously in the last couple of years, which is very weird considering how big Marvel movies currently are.
Yep.
You would see that as being a massive advertisement for the comics, right? The challenge being,
I think they've turned into toy sales.
Well, yeah, and that's fine too. I'm sure Lucas had a very similar point of view. Toys are very profitable pieces of things. And, Marvel was bankrupted and then was bought by a toy company, right? So Marvel in 1996 or 1996, I think, went bankrupt. And their toy vendor, their exclusive partner, basically bailed them out and bought them. And so that's where Avi Arad came from. Right, all those dudes that sort of masterminded the Marvel Studios thing years later were all toy guys who basically had
they understood.
Yeah, exactly. They understood ancillary marketing and revenue streams. But I think
let's go back to your point about the comic book. Yeah, because it seems like they sacked the writer's room, and now they don't have anybody there minding the ship for the future.
Yeah,
which is where they get all the great material from.
I agree. It's very unfortunate because they're still there's 50 years of like, I guess, pre-existing, pre-Marvel film canon to pull from. But the stuff they're doing now all ties into one short series, the Infinity Gauntlet, Infinity War series, right? Which was Jim Starlin and George Carlos in like early 90s, maybe. I have them all. They're very good. And they're massive space opera scaled things, right? They really play to this idea that the universe is huge and interrelated because they're one of those set pieces, the crossover set pieces that Marvel used to do, which came back like with, Civil War and that kind of stuff.
Right.
But so Marvel recently has been rebooting itself endlessly, right? In order to try and get new readers, it keeps launching new versions of Spider-Man and then killing them like a year later. And I think that that's disrespectful to the audience. You know what I mean? It's really, and they change, to your point, writers and artists a lot. So even I found it, to be honest, I've veered away from those comics, even as much as I like the history of them. I end up reading old X-Men, if anything at all. I'm more interested in the creator-owned universes that I'm sure we can get to, because there's some fun stuff happening there.
But you're going into something really. So when you were saying it's disrespectful and how universes reboot, and you were mentioning the Transformers, I wrote down Spider-Man.
Yeah,
I was actually thinking of the Fox film property version of Spider-Man that is on its fourth Spider-Man.
Yeah,
not the comic book, but the comic book. You're dead on. They've rebooted too, and they've been shedding readers because we want continuity. We crave it.
Yeah, and these kinds of myth structures do allow a certain degree of flexibility. But what got really boring with the Fox version of Spider-Man is they would reboot it to sort of get a younger actor who is less expensive, essentially, or whatever, and then tell the origin myth again and again. And you're like, nobody needs to see the Spider-Man origin myth ever again, right? That's just, no one needs that. Which is why it was great when they snuck him into Avengers, having done some sort of negotiation on that tip, right? There he is. It's like, you know who he is. He's Spider-Man. Don't worry about it. You're awesome. Like, yeah, it was awesome. And because it wasn't pandering to, like, I have to explain from the year dot how this whole thing works. It's like, we assume some knowledge, which is nicer in a way, right?
Yeah.
But yeah.
That was a relief. But
then I do think the X-Men franchise under Fox had some high points and some wavering points, and that when they started to really mess with the timelines, it got a lot more interesting again, frankly. It got a lot more fun for me when they started playing through different times.
Absolutely. And again, that's the Days of Future Past is a famous story that they quasi brought back. I mean, it's not true to it goes off book, but it's still a really interesting part of the universe.
Yeah, and it's a story that was 2 issues long in X-Men. Right. I think, Chris, whatever his name was, the great X-Men writer, Chris
Claremont.
Yeah, Claremont, I think, and Byrne did it in 2 issues. We'll wrap up some time travel stuff, get the Sentinels in there, don't worry about it.
Right, yeah.
But yeah, all these reboots basically, they're driven by a strategic imperative, which is that they own this property, they've paid for it. Like, X-Men, Fox bought X-Men rights for $1.5 million when Marvel was really struggling, basically, and needed a little bit of cash. So that was a very cheap piece of IP to buy that served them very well for quite a long time,
do you think they did okay on that investment?
I mean, I think they probably did fantastically well on that investment. So because that gets us down to kind of, I guess, the point, or not the point, but like one of the thoughts about why universes are now so obvious, and what the strategy behind it is, and what Marvel's strategy was as soon as Iger got in charge, which is the same thing, right? Iger's whole approach to Marvel has been to acquire universes.
Right.
Everything he does is buying. Every big deal he's structured, and they're the biggest deals Marvel has ever done, including the most recent one with Fox, which is buying the Avatar universe, the Simpsons universe. He's buying massive amounts of IP.
Right, extendable IP.
Yeah, at sort of, exactly, extendable IP at kind of premiums, but that he can lock in audiences for 20 years. And I think that's the point. So
yeah, and you wonder how much further it can go. Is Percy Jackson and is that whole series like, where are there new universes that we should be looking for?
Well,
or do you think
new ones
Disney is trying to? Yeah, go.
Well, so the new ones are slightly harder because depends where they come from, right, and how much they cost. So to me, it's like, how big is the audience that it brings to the table? Because my basic thesis is something like post the year 2000, when you can guarantee that every single person you met anywhere in the world had watched Friends, because they did.
Right.
When culture had become monoculture from not monoculture. Monoculture was a function of mass media. It created this monocultural system where everyone watched MTV or was aware of it to some degree, and Friends existed and Friends was a universe in its own right, kind of anyway. When fragmentation began in 2000, it led us on this path towards two things, which is a lack of mutual references, right? The more fragmented media is, the more fragmented culture becomes. And because of that, we don't have things to talk about with each other anymore. We didn't have shows at the water cooler we could discuss because everyone's on different shows and channels and platforms and, whatever. And that lack of those social objects became something I think people began to feel intuitively, whilst at the same time, it became more and more expensive to achieve fame and scale and buy audiences directly. So, famously, in media terms, you could reach 3/4 of America with 3 spots in the 80s or whatever, and now you can't.
Not even close.
Exactly. And that complexity and cost meant that being a filmmaker, and we've done some work with filmmakers before, studios, and the way they used to think about products was very different. Every new film was a new product, a new launch, a new audience that you had to build in 3 weeks.
Yeah.
And that just became very inefficient, I think. And they realized, well, what has built an audience is sequels. Sure. Remakes, fine. But what's more satisfying than that? And I think Marvel were extraordinarily ambitious from the very outset with Iron Man, which was a huge gamble for a publishing company to take on and pay for. But once they did it and they set this framework in place, you begin to see everyone doing it. DC's trying very hard and it's not necessarily working. But beyond that, they're everywhere. You can see them everywhere, I think.
I just read an article today about Mr. Robot. Do you watch that?
I did watch it. I haven't seen the most recent bits, I don't think. But first season I watched all the way through. Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, the second one kind of it's you brought up The Wire. I think later on it'll be looked at like the second season of The Wire. It takes you outside the story and then comes back in for season 3, which was awesome.
Okay, cool.
But the article was about how the writers fill the show with Easter eggs and clues to a game that happens offline. And the fans of the show on a bunch of different chat rooms dedicated to the show and on Reddit through a bunch of subreddits, they actually try to break these codes that are hidden in the show and in fake advertisements that they sneak into the advertising pods. So I was thinking, number one, I love that. I don't try to crack the codes or anything, but just knowing that it exists and seeing something when I'm watching the show and going, oh, that's probably a code. I wonder what what those guys would be doing with it. I think is very interesting and a new way to engage people and to help build interest in a smaller universe.
Yep.
But I was wondering from you, where do you think today, if you were an author or if you're Iger and you're trying to build the next universe, if you were trying to do it from scratch, where's the best place to do it? It was comic books.
Yep.
And then it was television. Where do you think is the best way to capture a big audience and do that? If it was your money.
It's a very interesting idea. I think ultimately the medium from which it originates isn't as important as its ability to be, to your point, extensible and ideally have an audience already. That's the biggest challenge, is building this audience from scratch now. The good thing about getting really passionate properties is that they come with this very passionate core audience, and depending on the size of that audience, I watched the Percy Jackson films, or a couple of them, but I didn't know it was a Harry Potter ripoff before that. I'm sure it was in book form. I think it's more, there's different approaches to this, right? So thinking about Iger, he recently pulled his content from Netflix, right? And the relationship between platform and distribution and content is increasingly blurry and has been for a while, right? What I thought was interesting about that particular announcement is that a week later, Netflix announced they bought Millarworld. Are you familiar with Millarworld?
I am. I haven't read any of the books, but I'm familiar with I know
So
the author.
Yeah, Mark Millar's kind of the most absurdly fecund writer in comics. Like it's truly remarkable the amount of stuff that's come out of his head. Just as a smattering. The films like Wanted and Kick-Ass and Kingsman are all his ideas, right? But so was Civil War, a book he wrote while at Marvel, which became Captain America 2. And so was Old Man Logan, which is the movie Logan from last year. He wrote that too.
Right.
He's remarkably prolific and in a way that's been very hard to match. But strategically speaking, when Marvel pulled their content from Netflix, the immediate reaction less than a week later to sort of bolster the market's concern about that was acquiring a whole universe of IP with the same heritage and credibility as those Marvel properties, because Miller was the executive creative consultant at Marvel for a long time.
He was it's the same voice.
Yes, exactly. And he's very good at this sort of thing. And I just thought that's really interesting that they did it. They announced it, obviously been in works for a while, I guess, but they announced it that week specifically to allay concerns that they had lost access to a universe. And so they bought one, you know?
That's so interesting, that connection that you made, because right now I feel that with the announcement of Disney buying the Fox properties and all the universes that you just mentioned, I feel like it's such a corporate time.
Mm-hmm.
But when in doubt, the pendulum goes back to, let's get the author who we know can turn out content that will turn into those universes. And Netflix has been doing that for 5 years, just giving artists the keys and just saying, hey, make something amazing and bring it to us.
Yes. And so it would be great because and talking about that part, right, the spinning off part, which is the same set of vectors that create the sort of conditions for universe strategy, if you like. It is what allows Stranger Things to exist and get greenlit by some two kids that haven't made like more than one movie before or something. Get greenlit, and also they're so good at it. They built the universe from other people's universes, and then like kind of own it now.
They do. They own the whole space of the 80s.
Right, exactly. But like they genuinely, like, if you do anything in that reference set now, you're pulling from Duffer, not directly from the 80s, which is a remarkable achievement. You know, that level of almost kind of, I don't know, reference apotheosis, you know, like, I don't know.
No, it's amazing because they tried, because who was it who made Super 8?
Abrams, right?
Yeah. So he made Super 8, and that was the whole intention of that film, was to steal from Spielberg.
Right.
And it was an okay picture, but it didn't become its own universe. There was never a call for a sequel.
Right.
But you're right. Stranger Things, when I watch that show and I see the Evil Dead poster on the wall, or I see, some of the Ghostbusters costumes, they take ownership of those things. Even, there's an episode where they have Kentucky Fried Chicken, and they're talking about Kentucky Fried Chicken and the ad that I remember from the 80s. And I just think, wow, they even own that.
And it's so nicely observed as well. And it's also, it doesn't struggle under the weight of its references because they're telling a different set of stories that just deploys lots of the same imagery and stuff, be it E.T. or otherwise. I mean, I think the Ghostbusters movie, the remake with Paul Feig, whatever his name is, was quite good, but I think it really struggled the most because it was trying to service too many references to itself.
Right.
Because it's like it's trapped in a set of characters and jokes appearing from the first movie to give it, I don't know, some sort of credibility about being part of that universe. But at the same time, it doesn't extend it. It just tells the story again with some winks at the camera. And I think it struggled under that a little bit, to be honest.
And that's the same thing that separates Marvel and DC. Marvel, it feels that Marvel has more confidence in putting underused characters like Black Panther, who's a critical character in the greater Avengers universe in the comic books.
Yeah.
But in film, that would be a risk, going back to what you said about Iron Man. I mean, if Iron Man is a risk, who's one of their top level heroes, then Black Panther, I would never expect to get a film. But Marvel just keeps on putting these, just saying we have great stories. Whereas DC suffers under the weight of saying, look, we're going to put Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman on one screen, and it's going to trust us, it's going to be great, but you could tell they don't believe it. Yeah,
and I think there is a well-documented split in the two universes that is usually expressed in terms of Marvel characters are broken, and DC characters are all Greek gods, basically, or like
they're all gods.
Yeah, they're all like Batman is. You can't empathize with Batman. You can you admire him, and reading the Scott Snyder Batman stuff he's amazing, but it's never going to be you. You're never going to be Superman. You're never going to be Batman. You're never going to be Wonder Woman. You know what I mean? They're all like the fantasies of children who are like, oh, maybe I was maybe I'm an secretly adopted wizard or princess or whatever. Whereas the Marvel superheroes all become superheroes, often from very traumatic social experiences or things, right? And they all struggle. They all struggle with their identity, with their responsibility, with balancing their real life. Whereas like Superman's real life is basically a joke. And do you know what I mean? Like there's some sort of weird division in those two, in sort of the meta narrative, the meta myth structure of those two universes.
No, I totally agree. And when, if we're going to go deep here on comic books, so sorry to everybody listening, but when Image came and all those creators left and they went to create their own superhero books that were sent, a lot of them, Rob Liefeld, I'm looking at you, were copy paste of characters that they were already drawing. They kept that broken model. Nobody went to the DC model except what was Supreme was a god, but he was broken too. Yeah,
well, he was a policeman, right? And so he had to deal with like being not Supreme. Sorry, that was the Savage Dragon. Yeah, Supreme was the one. He's sort of
kind of like Superman.
Yeah, but he sort of became the progenitor of Invincible, and Invincible's a really good take on that superhero typology.
And he did it by breaking him, though, by saying he's actually not, but underneath it all. And even Watchmen, they finally got it. DC, that was the first time they said, oh, no, they're vulnerable.
Yes.
And that's huge. And now they've expanded that universe, and they're trying to have it. There's a crossover, I guess, coming with the regular DC universe and Watchmen.
Yeah, Alan Moore will be very unhappy about that, I assume.
He is kicking a garbage pail right now, wherever he is.
Yeah, he's usually pretty unhappy about what happens to his characters, though, so...
I don't blame him, though. I don't blame him. He should be protective of those.
Yeah, it's true. But obviously stories require emotional resonance and some sense of identification. Otherwise, it gets a bit tiresome. And I think there was a great shift towards, in music, idea of giving up your copyright when you record an album for a studio was default, and then became an issue, right? With Prince famously being a slave. And the same thing happened with the comic book creators, right? They're creating characters and these ideas. They never owned anything. And that was a huge problem for Kirby and some of the other old first generation kind of creators. Because they never got any
until Prince gave his rights for the Batman soundtrack, ironically.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
This conversation,
But that idea of owning your own creation, I think, became a dominant thing in, to your point, the early 90s in different media. Comics, when OK Computer came out, Radiohead wrote the sleeve note saying, thanks to I think it was Sony, our label, for letting us use our music even though we wrote it. Which was, I think...
somebody gets it.
Yeah, and again, part of the drivers that allow for these things to happen now, which is if you have an audience from pre-fragmentation culture, you can now communicate with it directly and monetize your work without intermediaries and distribution mechanisms like record labels, film studios, publishing companies to some degree.
Well, you brought up Radiohead, and I know you didn't do that intentionally, but even thinking about universes, that is a group of artists that understands. What did they do with, it was OK Computer and what's the album 10 years later that they used to create the binary set?
In Rainbows or...
Yeah, I think it was. And if you play the tracks alternating, they left these little these sound bridges in there that connect every song on those two albums.
That's awesome.
I don't know if you've ever heard. Oh, I'll add a link.
Yeah.
But they were building a universe of their content, and nobody even caught on to it. It was finally they put out a release. It was like, I can't believe you guys haven't found this yet.
That's so great. This idea that everything you make builds to something larger is inherently very satisfying. I don't know why to my brain, but it feels like not just my brain, because it seems to be like across different media and kinds of creativity, this idea that rather than making one thing, make something that fits in and connects, so in about 2000 and because Netflix, right? Netflix had a chance to be a Netflix universe, but it hasn't decided to do that yet anyway. We'll see what happens with Miller World, but it's experimenting with different kinds of shows, right? So they don't all fit together, and it's using its algorithmic insight and so on and so forth to try and work out what shows will suit its audience and keep them locked in. I understand that as their strategy. But we were working with NBC when I was at Naked in like 2008, maybe 2009, in that region, on their rebrand or one of their many rebrands. And I asked NBC what their acquisition strategy was for content. And they said, we try and pick things that will be successful. And I said, that's not very strategic, though, is it? What's the filter? And I gave them two thoughts. I assume they ignored both of them. I left the agency shortly after this. But the first thought was, well, there are mass broadcasters that have a remit to be very broad, not to be a niche channel like, Characters Welcome on USA Today or the Comedy Channel, whatever, that are broad, but they have a remit. And so Channel 4 in the UK is not a universe, but Channel 4 content all fits together under their remit to service underserviced audiences. The government, whilst it's a commercial channel, the government still owns it, and therefore it has a mandate to serve underserved audiences, be it minorities of different kinds, sexuality, race, whatever. And so with that remit, you can get a sense of cohesion in their properties, right? At least
that makes sense.
Until they bought the Great British Bake Off and all bets are off now, let's be honest, right? The other thought was, well, the NBC was running at the time some Super Bowl spots, right? Or around that time. And the spots were promoting their own lineup, and maybe the Super Bowl's on NBC then, I have no idea, I can't remember. But the ads had different characters from like Scrubs and different shows meeting each other and in sort of tableau style 15-second stings, And I was like, that's pretty cool. That's like an NBC universe. That was the idea I pitched them, because I was like, remember when Friends was quite like a big deal, and the Friends universe sort of was constrained to Friends but extended out into games and coffee mugs and T-shirts and stores and experiences because it was that big a show,
Right. It was everywhere.
Yeah. It was hard to, 1999, that sort of time. But there was a character in it called Ursula who was Phoebe's sister, right? Her twin sister. How geeky do you want to get? Anyway, so
dude, I'm so sad because I know exactly what you're going to say because I remember all this.
So she was the same actress, obviously, but she was playing a different NBC sitcom before, and they pulled the character into Friends, and that would be her twin sister Ursula, right?
Yeah. And what was she from? Mad About You.
Mad About You. Yeah, previously they're one of their big Paul Reiser vehicle, whatever, right? So I was like, what would be kind of cool, like in those Super Bowl spots you made, if your shows existed all in the same universe? Because they already kind of do, and everyone likes it when Ursula appears because it pays off the people who know, and it doesn't detract from people who don't know. You can work on these different levels.
They did do a night where, with all the shows that were on that night, it was like Seinfeld, Friends, Mad About You, and I think the other one was called, The Single Guy, maybe. They did a blackout night where there was a blackout in New York, and all the characters had a story all the shows had a story where the characters got stuck in a blackout.
Yeah, that's cool. And the New York blackout was a big thing, so it makes sense. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it made sense.
Yeah, no, I think that kind of thing was really cool. I just think it's accretive, right? Everything you do builds to a larger experience and pays off some things and doesn't to others, rather than starting from scratch each time, which is harder, I think.
Well, it also makes sense when I can bite off 30-minute chunks in a sitcom versus, or even a 2-hour movie every year versus, having to go back and collect 20 trade paperbacks of X-Men to understand, or like go find the original X Factor stories to understand what's going to happen in the next X-Men movie.
Right. And there's something vaguely, I used to be, when the first set of Marvel films come out, my geekiness was in full swing, and I'd be like, this is what happens here, that's that character. And pretty quickly, in a few years, I begin to let go. And now I don't really want to remember if this is exactly right in canon, or if that character there is being used properly, whatever. Like, I think it's a different thing now, and I've sort of let that rescind slightly. But in its own universe, it should be accretive and satisfying rather than onerous. You don't want to give your audience a job, You don't want to give your audience a chore.
Let's just enjoy the movies for what they are, and then if I want to go back and read the comic books and compare notes, I guess I could, but I probably won't.
No, I think that's okay. I think I like stories that are retold in fresh new ways in order to move them forward, right? So a good example of this, to get back to Star Wars, I think anyway, is the difference between Rogue One and the first of the new Star Wars, the name I can't remember, the one with Rey in it.
Oh yeah, the Force Awakens.
Right, okay, so the Force Awakens is J.J. Abrams remaking A New Hope, almost scene for scene, with a female protagonist, and it's brilliant, right? It's great. It's taking the myth structure, telling it again for a whole new generation, but with a female protagonist, which is necessary at this stage in its evolution, frankly, and it's a great movie, and Rey is a really cool character, and all that stuff is great. But it's not homage. It does take the same storyline, but it does retell it rather than just tell it again, if that makes sense.
It makes sense.
And the distinction is nuanced. I accept this, but I do think there is a difference. Whereas Rogue One, right? Rogue One, I have not seen the new one, as I said, but Rogue One is probably my favorite Star Wars film as a film. Upon watching it, I was blown away by how well they had done what they did.
Yeah, I agree.
As a story, it's beautiful and self-contained. It's dramatic. But it's also they sort of disguised this in the promotions, didn't they? Didn't really know it was going to be a prequel to New Hope.
No, in fact, they said it's not until I was sitting in the theater and I said, well, wait a minute, I know that guy and I've seen that person and I remember that ship and I know that.
Yeah. And so as a film, I think it's my favorite, but it's also kind of this apotheosis of like sort of almost toxic nostalgia, because the film is contained entirely in the symbolism, imagery, and timeline of a pre-existing narrative structure. And so you know what's going to happen. What has to happen is the war has to come, right? Otherwise, nothing else will make sense. So you know a lot of those things. And it's like this weird example of a fan fiction homage movie becoming part of canon. Like this sort of ultimate desire of fan fiction is to be canon, right? Kind of. Or to do things you couldn't do in canon, like get people to hook up or whatever that thing is called. But to me, Rogue One is this particular weird example of like it's fan fiction, but it's also not. And it doesn't move the story on in any way. It kind of just builds some backstory. I don't know.
But it's somehow more satisfying.
As a film, yes, because it's self-contained in that sense, which maybe speaks against the whole universe strategy.
That's right. And I watched it again just on Netflix not too long ago, and so it's somewhat fresh in my mind, as fresh as my mind gets. And I was watching it to see, okay, now let's pretend I've never seen the other movies. What, is there anything in here that wouldn't connect for me or that I missed? And watching it that way and just trying to make myself close doors to Star Wars and to the greater universe, it's still a good movie. There's not things in there that you needed to know.
And in some ways, it's like how the difference between Star Trek TNG and DS9, right? So TNG exists in the universe, but every episode is self-contained narrative, give or take a couple of double episodes, right? So you can watch one and it's like the whole emotional arc of that story is completed, wrapped up, and you go to credits, right? Whereas the DS9 stuff, it ended up being much more like kind of expansive, multilinear. Things went on and on and on and on. And that was much harder to follow unless you really wanted to be hardcore. And so there's room for both, there's room for the self-contained nuggets of narrative in these universes people love.
And that's kind of where things like Lord of the Rings trilogy went astray, when they had a cliffhanger where the company just, we're all going to walk this way. And, the movie ends and you say, well, hold on a minute. You didn't finish this story. I mean, what's going on? They're just going to walk off like that and we don't know what's going to happen? Well, it's a trilogy. So it's a part connects to this bigger universe. And I'm like, yeah, but I only paid for this part of it. I only paid for Act 2. So why am I getting left with the middle of the story? You still have to make it have a close, what Marvel does in space.
Yes, agreed. You're really, yes. Like the film, and also the Hobbit two-parter as well. The Hobbit, that goes on forever, that movie. And it doesn't
they could have done that in an hour.
Very, very easily. And it's slightly because they got such success with the three that they wanted to do it that way, I guess. But that structural thing is the hard bit, right? If you're a showrunner, or like Paul Feig at Marvel, who kind of owns the overall universe for them, giving people the it's like writing a good brief, right? It's like giving people enough parameters to keep them in line, but giving them the freedom to write something really beautiful inside that, rather than saying you've got to get to these points, you know?
Yeah, you still have to give, even when the best directors for improv will give their talent the beats. Hey, you can say whatever you want, but I need you to eventually to get to this part of the story.
Right.
You have to, this is your motivation.
Yeah.
You've heard about how to do Curb Your Enthusiasm in that same way.
Yeah. And you can definitely see how that can be a highly abrasive or difficult creative relationship from all the Marvel directors that get removed from their movies, right? Because ultimately, like, the vision has to fit into this overall architecture or it won't work. But at the same time, if all it does is pay off the beats you need to pay it off, it won't be a film.
Right. It's nothing interesting about it.
Right. And then just Lord of the Rings thing, right? Did you see recently, I think Amazon is going to is buying Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So, like, I couldn't get my head around that for a second. I was like, I don't have any appetite left for Lord of the Rings-ness at all, personally.
Same.
And then someone said, well, what if it isn't Lord of the Rings, though? It's just that universe and you can tell whatever story you want. And I was like, all right, well, fair enough. Yeah, I suppose you could do that. You know, that hadn't occurred to me. So that's good.
Still, yeah, it's going to be a tough sell for me. I guess that I'm sure that's...
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's because we're different kinds of fandoms, right? The fantasy fandom is very specific, I guess. But I thought that was boring. Whereas conversely, I saw an announcement last week, I think, that the Archie universe is being developed more fully.
You sent me this link. Yeah,
right.
Do tell.
Yeah, so I haven't seen Riverdale, so again, forgive me for my lack of preparation. But apparently it's very interesting and, you know, a dark modern interpretation on Archie's kind of very saccharine, childish stuff, right? But the bit, in fact, this is what led us to some degree to this topic beyond just talking about Star Wars because it's fun, is that the guy who runs Archie Comics is also the producer of Riverdale, and he's sort of gone out and said they're going to try and move into this whole empire and this whole universe, including Sabrina the Teenage Witch, who is an Archie character, and Melissa Joan Hart being brilliant, but they want to make it dark and modern and stuff, which is cool. She was great, though, right? Great show. And the fact that their universe, they have this body of IP, right? There's like the Josie and the Pussycats. There's, I think, Casper. There's all kinds of superheroes in the Archie universe that no one's ever heard of. So they're very consciously saying, this works. Let's go for it, you know?
I think they're picking up exactly what you're talking about. It's just how we know that this works to get eyeballs. And if we get 10% of the people who watch Riverdale to watch this other show plus a new audience, we've won.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think it's become more obviously the dominant, like, creative strategy du jour, right? It works on the model of Star Wars that you can sell toys and comics and ancillary, whatever, licensing rights to craft cheese doodles and, you know, whatever. Once you've got the characters, once the characters have enough audience, then you can sell it in lots of different ways, which is a hugely useful commercial strategy. And then in terms of the products themselves, you can then, you know, move from audience to audience and carry them over as much as possible. But it also means to me that once anything becomes the default or the orthodoxy, then we've got to start looking for the next idea, right? So that's...
I think we could do another show about that topic of what do we think is the next thing, unless you're writing a book on that right now.
I'm not, but I have been thinking about it and I don't have strong ideas yet. So let's bounce it off and then...
let's get together when we're in the same city, should that happen.
Yeah.
I'd love to talk over a pint.
That would be lovely. I would very much enjoy that.
Hey, before I let you go, 2 questions.
Yes.
First, we've gone way over time here, but that's okay. It's great. Right. It's great conversation. First question is, do you think any X-Men will make an appearance now in the upcoming Infinity Wars?
When's the next one due out? This year, next year? No, this year, right?
I think early 2018,
I think that would be tight, to be honest.
Yeah. Do you think even like a post-credit scene with Wolverine walking into the frame?
That would be pretty cool.
Magneto?
That would be pretty cool. Let's say it would be a great Easter egg, I think, but like I don't know if even the acquisition would be, you know, ratified or whatever by that point. So maybe. I think let's say maybe.
Okay. And then question 2 is a much easier question that takes much less mental capacity. What do you have coming up that you'd like to tell our listeners about? Anything you want to promote?
Well, it's a great question. I am currently working on some things for clients that I can't promote because there's no point. But Rosie and I are probably going to publish some new things this year. some new elements of first the book, Paid Attention, some new thoughts around maybe not quite a sequel, but some other publications. But the thing right now I'd love you all to rush to and look at is called Postcards for Progress. So
tell me more.
Through our newsletter and on our website, we crowdsourced designs from our designy friends. And every designer who put a design in place got to pick a cause that they wanted to donate the profits to. And so you can buy postcards on our website at geniussteals.co/postcards-for-progress. And all the profits go to the causes nominated by each designer. And we have donated the fulfillment, and they'll be coming out in January.
Oh, that's awesome. I will include a link to that in the show notes here because, dude, that's so great. What kind of causes are you
pretty much all Rose's idea, but there's some... actually, interestingly, the designers have picked quite a lot of smaller causes, which is kind of cool. Things that we hadn't heard of, which is kind of a nice one. I'll give you a couple of examples. There is... there's the Black Youth Project, aka BYP 100, which helps train, organize, and mobilize young Black activists. There is the Zen Peacemakers. The 3 tenets of that cause are not knowing, bearing witness, and compassionate action, and they're a movement for peaceful but potent social activism. We have one for phone credit for refugees, which provides mobile phone top-ups with asylum seekers and refugees separated from their families by war and conflict. Yeah, they're all... Actually, the causes are really interesting. That's one of the things that they're not the obvious. Like we did some fundraising for the Brady campaign last weekend at an event we were hosting, and that was great. But it feels like these smaller causes, more local, more specific, get more emotional resonance from people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's awesome. That's an awesome program, and again, we'll link to it.
Well, thank you very much.
Faris, I want to thank you so much for making time. I know you're usually in an airport or heading to or from one, so thank you for making time for this, man. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Pleasure, mate. Me too. Thank you for letting me geek out.
Yeah, no, that was fun. That was fun. So as always, guys, you can find Faris. Faris, are you just at Faris on Twitter?
Yeah, at Faris, Faris on Twitter. That's the easiest way to find me.
I think he has almost all the Twitter users following him anyway, but if you're not, you should track him down. If you have thoughts for me, you can also hit me up at @apierno or at Santi Integrated. Thanks again, everybody, for listening. Please let us know what you think.
Bye.